Hi folks, welcome to the Gaming Guillotine, where I extol the excellent and execute the poorly executed. And speaking of poorly executed, what the hell was Sony doing with their PlayStation 5 Pro announcement? Being well off or bad at budgeting enough to be one that owns all the current generation consoles, the PlayStation 5 is the one in the current generation that's been seeing the most recent use out of me, even though I actively avoid the notion of fanboyism and detest those devoted to brand loyalty. But like Trump's pet-eating rant in the latest debate, seeing the news around the PS5 Pro was rather confusing.
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets.
The price point of $700 alone is going to drive most away. The main significant upgrade is the GPU in the console, while most everything else stays the same. Then compound the fact that it has no version that comes with a disk drive or stand, and you begin to comprehend why a lot of people are thinking that, instead of staying in the Sony ecosystem, they are thinking that now might be the time to try out PC gaming. Now, granted, there are GPUs out there that cost more than a PlayStation 5 Pro alone, but on the other hand, it is also entirely possible to build PCs that trade blows with consoles for lesser, if not equal, price points. Not only that, but they can be upgraded far easier than consoles. You can make gaming PCs that game well on almost any budget, and for those wondering how low they can go, I wanted to feature a graphics card today that can be easily had for less than $50. Released in January of 2015 and serving as a low to mid-tier performer for the 9th generation of NVIDIA GTX graphics cards, the 960 was a modest but capable workhorse for its time. Now, while the exact model might differ from the one I'm holding, the GTX 960 was the first graphics card I ever purchased, and believe it or not, is still receiving driver updates as of September 11th. You know, I didn't think about how awkward that would be to say, and now I don't know how to segue out. But with all that set up, how does the almost decade-old GPU perform on the modern-day stage? For those who are unfamiliar with my means of review for hardware, I'm not one who's big on technical specifications. I understand a few things on a basic level, but I try to communicate and relay information as an everyman. I perceive value and performance through general use and practical application. See my reviews on the Steam Deck and Poly Mega consoles if you need further examples. With all that set dressing established, I first assembled a PC to serve as a test bench with which to put a few games through their paces. Without getting bogged down in details, here's the parts list on screen. It's not a system that'll be sitting at the top of any modern bench test by any stretch of the imagination, but it's very able to facilitate modern gaming with current components. Lastly, for a gaming PC, it is surprisingly cheap. Not including the subject of today's video, the GTX 960, this machine could be recreated for less than $275 through the use of sales and second-hand parts. So with all that out of the way, let's look at some software. Before we look into some games, I wanted to run some bench tests. First was FurMark. It set my expectations as low, but not bad. Running at 1080p, the FurMark donut was rendered and the frame rate held steady at about 40 FPS. Given consoles regularly settle at 30, I saw no reason that you couldn't jump in and play games. I also ran the Shadow of the Tomb Raider bench test, and it ran on high settings at 1080p and rarely dipped below 30 FPS. Maybe not great, but then again, perfectly playable if it remained stable at that level. Although I did notice some screen tearing, at least until I turned on VSync. But enough bench tests. Let's try some games, and what better place to start than a game that's still fairly popular, in spite of predating the 960 by about 8 years. I didn't spend much time in Team Fortress 2 for the sake of the test, but what time I did spend was validating to say the least. In gameplay, I was sitting pretty at well over 120 frames per second, hitting 200 fairly consistently. Then again, not shocking. TF2 could probably run on a potato if you needed it to. Not a shocking result, but nice confirmation for those looking for a free multiplayer game that modest hardware can handle. So let's stay in the realm of modest hardware requirements, but move on to the mindset of a much more current and popular game. Cult of the Lamb fared a bit worse, but only in the sense that I once again had to cap the frame rate with VSync, which I would consider worse in the sense of letting the hot fudge sit on your ice cream for a minute, causing the temperature to balance out and melt a little of your dessert. It is still 100% playable, and minus some moments where the frames dipped into the mid-40s, I didn't have any noticeable complaints. I was clearly able to see the action on screen and respond accordingly, something that was also vital for my next game. Doom 2016 seemed a little rocky out of the gate, but on high settings I was stable at 40 frames per second. With the fast-paced action and need for mobility and preservation, I didn't really have time to notice if there was anything lacking in texture. I was still the harbinger of hell's destruction, dishing out lead and rockets, ripping and tearing to my heart's content. But what if I want to play something a little bit more relaxed and low energy? Let's try one of my favorite games from last year with Station to Station. In my limited understanding of things, I know that voxel graphics are much more demanding on the hardware processing. This was illustrated when I would zoom in close and the frame rate started to chug. Nevertheless, in a low-intensity game such as Station to Station, you stop moving and messing around with things, and the video output quickly stabilized, and you were allowed to take in the serene landscape. Something that I equally look forward to with the next game I chose to test the 960 on. Journey by that game company is my second favorite game of all time, and originally came out about 2 years ahead of the 960 in March of 2013, and came to PC in 2020. So I'd say it has a fair degree of parity with the era and hardware it was made for. Testing it out on today's featured GPU, the session was buttery smooth and gobsmackingly gorgeous. But the deserts of Journey weren't the only wasteland I decided to visit for these tests. Metro Exodus is a game I've been wanting to revisit, and is probably one of the most demanding games in my Steam library. Fortunately, the minimum requirements fall just within the territory of what the 960 can handle, recommending a GTX 670 or 1050, both of which get trounced and have their lunches eaten by the 960. I was minorly worried that Exodus would take a significant hit to performance once the story moved from the confined environments and into the open world mini sandbox territories. Fortunately, no such hit took place, and I was able to play quite comfortably. It's here that I have to point out that even low settings in modern games look really damn good, even when moving fast, which I suppose is the perfect opportunity to shift to one of my favorite racing games of 2021. Hot Wheels Unleashed didn't really need much tweaking, but did take chunks out of my frame rate as long as I kept the settings on high. Medium, however, stabilized my frames at 60 frames per second, and otherwise I don't really have much to say. It was stable, looked fine, and was perfectly acceptable. However, the video thus far has been showing games that run fine and by and large don't target the most high-end specs. So what happens when I start to check out games that do? Starting off with the first example, I have at most marginal experience with Warhammer 40k, but Speed Freaks sat on my wish list so long that I couldn't help but be compelled to give it a try. Having played a little on my main rig, it seemed like something I could be into. Looking at the Steam store page for minimum specs, it says the lowest card you should be using is a GTX 1650. Basically the next NVIDIA card up the ladder just above the 960. So I wasn't expecting much. Not much is also subsequently what I got for graphical fidelity. Granted, I rocketed all the settings as low as they would go, but having done that, while I wasn't able to admire the environment or models to any appreciable amount, the game was surprisingly playable. The HUD elements were nice and clear enough where I was able to determine enemies and objectives and respond accordingly. But now let's move on to a really heavy hitter. Recommending a GTX 1060 as the bare minimum, Cyberpunk 2077 was where I thought I was going to hit a wall of unplayability. Imagine my surprise when the game actually dared to run. It's worth noting that I suspect the rest of the rig was picking up a fair degree of slack, but the game did technically run, or walk in the very least. That's to say, it didn't exactly run well. At least not without adjusting settings. 1080p had me sitting somewhere between 15 to 25 FPS. Ranging from barely playable to not at all. So I went back into the menus to see if I could make it playable. All optional graphic settings off. Lowest settings everywhere. Minimal crowds. 720p windowed. And you know what? That did it. I mean, I'm not sure how many people would actually want to play like that, but the brief window I did try was 60 FPS or higher. One of the most demanding games out there technically running on a decade-old GPU. Now, you think this would be where things start to wind down, but wait, I have one last twist. You see, the GTX 960 had two main variations that, at this level of performance, can make a world of difference. A variation with 2 GB of VRAM, and a model with 4 GB. For those not familiar with how that affects things, the storage there refers to how many textures and how much data it can hold on standby to render the immediate area in the game. If you run out of space, then things slow down because it has to start using the RAM of the computer itself to compensate and swap out textures depending on where you're looking. So what if I told you that everything in the video thus far was captured off of the 2 GB model? Because it's true. So what happens when we crack open the machine, swap to a 4 GB model, and then go again? Let's go back to Cyberpunk. Still all low settings, but 1080p and a stable 60 frames per second. Let's go. It's almost amazing what 2 gigabytes more of VRAM will do. What about Warhammer? Well, things still look kinda muddy, but I feel like there was an improvement in visuals. Not enough necessarily to look good, but an improvement nonetheless. So let's look at one last new game. One that, like Cyberpunk, recommends a card above the 960 for bare minimums, but at this point I think it's safe to say that we're looking at those specs similarly to Captain Barbossa. More guidelines than actual rules. Forza Horizon 5, with a minimum of a GTX 970 with more of a gap in performance than the 1650. But you know what? I don't give a Horizon 5 automatically put the settings to very low, but I wouldn't have known if it didn't tell me, save for a few model textures in the jungle area. The game looked damn good, and I don't think I saw it dip below 50 frames per second, even when the open world was activated for me. And for one last joke that I would slap myself for not making at this point, yes, it runs Crysis. Now, while I could likely find a few games that just outright refuse to run, like Black Myth Wukong or one of those body cam shooters, I wanted to illustrate a couple points today. First of all, I have a soft spot for the 960 and wanted to show off that while limited and demanding one to be conscious of its boundaries, it is still capable, especially when you consider the price. While the 9 series is still getting driver updates, there are whispers that this could be the last month that we're getting them. That being said, I was able to acquire the 2GB 960 for a measly $21, and the 4GB model? Surely that had a significant jump in— Wrong! The 4GB was only $25, a $4 price increase, and when you consider the 1030, the 1050, and the 1630 are still being sold brand new for over $100, there is no reason why you couldn't go for this guy for low-end budget builds. Which I suppose is perfect to use as a springboard to hone in on the final point. The whole reason I made this a gaming guillotine episode. You know, the format where I try to include a larger point about gaming culture. That point being, while it's not universal, PC gaming and building culture has a bit of a snobbery perception problem. A small subset of PC users get uppity or develop a superiority complex when it comes to their hardware. Everything must be high-end. Anything older than 2 years is an antique and not worth your time. And Microsoft isn't helping this with their Windows 11 hardware mandates. But if anything, I hope I've driven one key point home. There's nothing wrong with older or used hardware so long as it works. Expense is often considered the biggest hurdle for a lot of people wanting to get into PC gaming, and that perception isn't helped when people say things like, you should be spending at least $300 on a graphics card, or a budget of under $500 for a PC is basically useless. Let's go back to the start of the video as a direct counter. Not including shipping for individual components, this rig, which was responsible for all the main footage captured today, was assembled and almost exclusively used from parts I got from eBay, and cost less than an Xbox Series S. For an additional $100, you could put in a GPU that could play literally anything on medium settings, and that's probably one of the best things about PCs. You can upgrade them to your own satisfaction. I myself have a very capable machine, and I didn't use it at all for any of the capture footage featured on today's video. Gaming on almost any budget is possible. And I'll be returning next week to do a follow-up video where I do my own hyper-budget build. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe that I just had some parts dropped off at my door. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.